So we were asked to talk a bit about the different kinds of dilemmas the normative dilemmas that liberals face when they try to defend liberal democracy. So we'll talk briefly about 3 dilemmas that appear at different levels. So I'll start by talking about more general theoretical level, and we'll say something about institutions. And then Zoltan will talk about kind of the individual ethics. So, the first dilemma is about the way in which liberals should defend liberalism. So for many years, the idea was that everyone kind of basically agreed with basic liberal values, and then the debate about liberalism was what kind of liberals should we be, not whether we should be liberals or not. So liberalism was thought just kind of a set of basic rights in which these rights were defended basically on political terms, freedom and equality, and a very thin notion of personal autonomy. But it seems that some people are not convinced anymore by this approach. It seems that citizens are turning against this thinner notion of liberalism. And there has been some push by some academics, but I think also in general, to think about a thicker version of liberalism, one that is more robust, that talks about, as Alexander Lefebvre says, a liberalism as a way of life. So the idea of people like Alexander Lefebvre is to think of liberalism as a project of self-discovery, as a project of personal ethics, as a project of just kind of a very, very thick notion of personal autonomy. And the hope for these people is that by presenting this robust notion of liberalism, we can convince those who are moving away from liberalism to come back and accept liberal ideas. So I think this is a real dilemma for liberals. And the problem is that the thicker our notion of liberalism is, the less ecumenical it would be. So the advantage of the previous view, the Rawlsian view in which liberalism is defined only as a system of toleration, is that basically the only thing is required from people is not to use political power to enforce their comprehensive views. And then everything else was left to the private. So for instance, what Stefan was saying, if you're a Catholic or a Muslim, it's up to you to think exactly how your religious beliefs fit with liberalism. On this thicker version, liberals say, well, what you have to do to have a good life or to be autonomous is to actually put forward your beliefs, scrutinize them, critically assess them. And it might be that the true view is the liberal view, but it also risks losing support. So when I think about this, I think about my extended family, who are deeply Catholics. And if the challenge for them is either to believe on the Immaculate Conception of Mary or to be a liberal, they will probably accept the Immaculate Conception of Mary. They don't have the disposition to criticize his religious beliefs. So this is, I think, the trade-off that this bolden liberalism forces or seems to be requiring of people. The risk is that by having a thicker version, then we lose people who were already liberals and who thought that liberalism in this thinner sense was compatible with their views about the good life or God or whatever. The second dilemma is about institutions and precisely the role and the strength that illiberals and the kind of rights that illiberals have. So this is the old version about militant democracy. And so I'm not an expert on militant democracy, but I think it hasn't been very clear exactly what is the status of political rights for militant Democrats. So one view, which I think is the standard view, is that political rights are conditional and are based on some sort of reciprocity, right? I have political rights only insofar as I respect the political rights of other people. And if I don't respect the political rights of other people, then I don't have these rights. So in that sense, they are conditional. Another way, which I think is more promising, doesn't conditionalize political rights, but thinks of political rights in terms of liabilities. So the inspiration here comes from the ethics of self-defense and just war theory. So the idea is that people can do things to lose their rights. So rights are not conditional. Nevertheless, by threatening others and by imposing the threat on harm on other people, you can lose your rights. I think that's clear in the case of self-defense, right? I have a right not to be killed, but I can lose that right by posing a legal threat to someone else. And then if political rights also take this form, then it might be that in some circumstances, we are permitted to restrict the political rights of liberals. And the idea here, I guess, is that if harm will occur, given certain actions, it is fair that it falls on those who cause these harms as opposed to someone else. So if the chances that the value of democracy will cease or liberal rights will be compromised, and we have to choose whether the harm falls on those who uphold these rights, on those who are threatening these rights, it is fair that it falls on those who threaten the rights. So in that sense, illiberals are liable to lose certain rights. This is just kind of a very sketchy view. A full view will depend on developing an account of proportionality, to what extent restricting rights is proportional to the harm that will occur. It will depend on having a view of what is the importance of political rights and what is the value of liberal rights or democracy. So the full view will need to be spelled out, and that will give us a better sense of to what extent political rights can be restricted and on what circumstances. That being said, it is only a liability view. This would mean that it is permissible sometimes to restrict political rights, but it doesn't say that we actually have a reason to do that. Whether we employ that possibility will depend on empirical facts, on whether it is more harmful than not. Perhaps it's better to not restrict political rights, given that by doing so, other liberal access will be emboldened, but that needs lots of empirical information. Second part of this institutional question has to do with exactly to what extent we can modify the institutional background that emboldens illiberal politics. And I think there seem to be two main things. One is the way in which political campaigns are carried out. Political campaigns now seem to be really empty. It's about slogans and shirts and people having breakfast with their cats. And that might be one in which politics is just getting emptied. And on that in that trend of political marketing, it might be that liberals end up being worse off, because the ideal of liberal democracy I take to be it's a form of collective deliberation. But if there is no collective deliberation, then we are in a different kind of landscape. The other side of the coin is the way in which we should think about the media landscape, and especially the regulations and the ownership of social media. So social media has revolutionized the way in which politics work. I don't think people are less informed now than they used to be, but what is true is that the sources of information are fractured and they come from other places. So liberals have to think about how to respond to this. And one way to think about it is that perhaps the algorithms should be considered as public domain. That would require, for instance, perhaps to change the ownership of the media or to subject the algorithms to popular control, to have to kind of try to democratize the way in which social media works. That assumes that liberals have the political power to do that and the political capital to do that, not only at home, but internationally. And that it might be that we are not there anymore. But I think these are the kind of institutional changes that liberals might try to support. That being said, now I go to Zoltan, who will talk of what to do when liberals have very little political power.
Thank you very much. Andres and I are philosophers, and philosophers are sometimes accused of being more interested in the questions than in the answers. I think there's something to it, but not fully justified. That being said, indeed, as part of the AUTHLIB project, our task was more about creating a kind of conceptual and theoretical map of the normative questions that arise in the context of containing illiberalism and reversing democratic breakdown. So we are very much interested in categorizing the different questions. So I'm just going to mention two dimensions along which these questions can be categorized and then say something about a few of these questions. So first, we can categorize the different normative questions in relation to what kinds of actors they arise in. So for instance, there are questions for the state-citizen relationship. These are some of the questions that Andres talked about. But there are also questions for the citizen-citizen relationship as they arise in the for citizens as they act in their individual capacity. And of course, there are some questions for the state-state relationship. For instance, within the context of the European Union, whether and what if anything, the European Union should do about member states where democracy has broken down. So that's one dimension. Another dimension is questions that arise, so to say, before the fall and after the fall. Before the fall of democracy, questions of containment, and after the fall, questions of reconstruction. And as we learned in this workshop that we held about a year ago here, most of these questions have a dilemmatic nature. That is to say that there are very strong pull normative reasons, moral reasons in different directions. Let me just mention briefly 3 different normative questions where this dilemmatic nature can be seen very clearly. One question within the citizen-citizen relationship is when we think about reconstruction, democratic reconstruction after the fall. If there's one issue on which political scientists tend to agree is that, to use Professor Lindbergh's term, for a U-turn to be executed, one thing that is certainly necessary is for there to be a broad electoral coalition between different opposition actors. But that means that ideologically very diverse actors, parties, voters, have to act together. And that raises the question of whether citizens and politicians acting in their names should prioritize reconstruction and reconciliation between ideological diverse constituencies, or whether they should, especially liberals, should prioritize solidarity with vulnerable, disadvantaged groups who tend to be the primary targets of authoritarian politics, such as ethnic minorities, religious minorities, women, and so on. So this is the question, for instance, whether is it okay to make electoral coalitions with far-right parties that may be out of power in order to rebuild democracy. And there are genuine reasons for and against, on both sides of this dilemma. Another question that I personally spent some time thinking about is whether Democrats should engage in autocratic elections, the kinds of elections, authoritarian elections that exist in Hungary, Turkey, that have a variety of interesting characters. They do give some chance for Democrats to rebuild, to defeat the autocratic ruling party, the autocratic regime, but that chance is relatively limited. According to the best data that I could come across, about maybe 1 in 5 or 1 in 4 autocratic elections lead to the defeat of the ruling party. So that's not nothing, but also not very promising. At the same time, we also know from empirical political science that authoritarian elections are a very powerful and potent tool for the autocrat to control society, to monitor the elites, public opinion, and so on. So there is a dilemma for democratic voters, democratic politicians, whether to play their part, so to say, in the authoritarian control participating elections in the perhaps elusive hope of defeating the autocrat. Finally, I'd like to highlight a third question very briefly. Assuming that Democrats managed to come to power as a result of autocratic elections, as they had in Poland, for instance, to what extent should they abide by procedural constraints that were put in place by the autocratic regime in order to rebuild democracy? In Poland, this came to the fore, became salient mostly in the context of dismissing judges that were appointed during the previous regime, and you can also see here powerful reasons pulling in different directions. So I'm going to stop there because you may not see this, but red lights are flashing here telling me that my time is up, so thank you very much.